were not the emperors, the marshals, or the glittering names that echo through history. They were men, peasants pulled from their villages, artisans, who once bent iron and wood farm boys who had known only the softness of soil beneath their boots before they were handed a musket and told they were the instruments of empire. These were the forgotten soldiers of Napoleon's Grand Army, and in 1812 they began a journey that would lead them into the white jaws of the Russian winter. When Napoleon set his gaze eastward, his army stood at nearly 500,000. It was a force so vast, so mighty, that chroniclers of the time could hardly find words to describe it. Soldiers from every corner of his empire marched together: French, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Germans, even Spaniards. They spoke different tongues, sang different songs, but in their packs they carried the same thin rations, and in their eyes they carried the same obedience to the man they called the emperor. They believed, perhaps dimly, that glory awaited them on the road to Moscow. The summer sun beat down as they crossed the Niemen River, that ancient boundary which marked the entry into Russian lands. The air was heavy, still, and deceptive. For a brief moment the men felt almost at ease. They believed the campaign would be like the others: swift march, decisive battles, and the triumphant thunder of Napoleon's name shaking the capitals of Europe. But Russia was not like Spain, nor Italy, nor Prussia. Russia stretched endlessly. Its villages lay scattered across wide plains, its roads were little more than rutted tracks, and its sky carried moods that shifted without warning. The Grand Army entered it as though stepping into a world beyond maps, a land vast enough to swallow even 500,000 men. At first, the march had its rhythm. Dust rose from the columns as tens of thousands of boots trampled the earth. Wagons creaked, horses neighed, drums rolled in steady cadence. But behind this spectacle of power lurked the subtle weight of hunger and thirst. Forage was scarce, wells ran dry, and Russian peasants, warned in advance, had carried off their stores and livestock, leaving behind only charred ruins. It was the first taste of a strategy that would become the soldiers' undoing. A land stripped bare before them, food vanished into smoke, water fouled or poisoned. The soldiers bore it as soldiers do. They joked, cursed, and then sang. They marched with packs that cut into their shoulders, slept on damp earth, and awoke each dawn to the endless call forward. Yet the first cracks appeared quickly. Men collapsed from heat stroke, horses died by the thousands, wagons sank into the mire of broken roads. Behind the glitter of banners, the Grand Army was already thinning, but Napoleon pressed them forward, deeper into the belly of the Russian land. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The vast distances mocked their steps. Towns were entered, seized, and found empty. Villages offered nothing but silence and ashes. Sometimes, in the distance, soldiers glimpsed Russian troops, then found them vanished again, retreating ever eastward. There was no great battle to bring swift victory, no triumph to crown the sacrifice. Only a march that grew heavier with each mile. By September, the signs of the coming winter stirred in the air. Frost appeared in the mornings, a crisp bite that clung to the men's coats and stiffened their breath. Fires became harder to light. The nights grew cruel, long, and restless. The men still believed in the emperor, yet doubt seeped into their bones. Why had they come so far? What lay ahead in Moscow but more emptiness? When Moscow finally appeared before them, the city of golden domes seemed like the prize they had sought. Exhausted, starving, and broken in spirit, the soldiers entered expecting relief, expecting shelter, but Moscow was not a gift. It was a trap. The city had been abandoned, its treasures carried off, its homes set aflame. Fire swept through the wooden streets, devouring the city in red waves, leaving only smoke and ruin. The men wandered the ashes, clutching their thin coats tighter against the creeping cold. They tore boards from houses for fuel, slaughtered the last horses for meat, and wrapped themselves in whatever scraps they could find. Still, the nights froze them, the winds clawed at them. Each breath seemed to carve ice into their lungs. Winter had arrived in earnest. The Russian winter, merciless, vast, and indifferent. Snow fell endlessly, covering the earth in white silence. Rivers turned to iron beneath the ice. Fires sputtered and died in the winds. The soldiers' boots wore through until their feet bled and blackened. Fingers stiffened and snapped like brittle twigs. Men fell asleep in the snow and never rose again. It was no longer an army. It was a column of ghosts, stumbling westward, trying only to survive. The great invasion had become a retreat, a nightmare march where hunger gnawed deeper than bullets and frost killed more than bayonets. The soldiers trudged past the corpses of their comrades, past the bones of horses picked clean, past wagons overturned and frozen solid. Those who still lived carried memories that would haunt them until their last days. They remembered the sound of silence in the forests, broken only by the moans of the dying. They remembered the feeling of snow inside their boots, soaking into flesh that turned purple and dead. They remembered comrades who begged for mercy, for fire, for food, and found none. And they remembered, most of all, how small they felt beneath that endless Russian sky, a sky that seemed to close over them like the lid of a tomb. When the remnants of the Grande Armée finally limped back across the Niemen, they were not 500,000 strong. They were scarcely a fraction, a tattered shadow of their former glory. The world would remember Napoleon, the emperor, the strategist, the man of destiny, but the soldiers, the forgotten soldiers who froze in the snow, their stories would be lost in silence. Yet it was they who bore the true weight of that disaster, they who gave their flesh and breath to the ambition of one man. Their names are gone, but their suffering lingers, frozen forever in the vast whiteness of 1812. The retreat began not with the thunder of drums or the order of trumpets, but with a silence heavy enough to crush the soul. The Grand Army, once a spectacle of banners, cavalry, and cannon, now staggered through the ashes of Moscow like a procession of the condemned. The soldiers looked back at the burning city, its towers swallowed by smoke, its domes blackened by flame. And they realized that nothing lay ahead but the road, a road that led through the heart of a frozen empire. Napoleon gave the command to march. The emperor himself still rode with an air of unshaken authority, but his men had ceased to see him as a savior. To them, he was a distant figure cloaked in furs, his gaze fixed westward, his words drowned by the howl of the wind. The soldiers did not follow him now out of devotion. They followed because there was no choice. Behind them stretched the endless plains of Russia, already closing in with ice. Before them stretched only the faint memory of France, home, hearth, warmth. The snow came in waves, carried by winds that slashed across the steppe like invisible knives. At first, the men tried to march as soldiers in ranks with muskets slung on their shoulders, but the snow dragged at their boots, the wind blinded their eyes, and soon the order dissolved. Columns stretched thin, men straggled, wagons fell behind. The army ceased to be an army. It became a swarm of desperate figures trudging west, each step an act of defiance against the winter. Hunger stalked them. The meager supplies that had been carried out of Moscow vanished quickly, eaten in haste, bartered, stolen, or lost in the snow. Bread turned to stone in the frost, and teeth cracked against it. Soldiers gnawed on leather straps, on the bark of trees, on whatever could fill the void inside their stomachs. When horses collapsed, their carcasses were torn apart by starving hands, raw flesh swallowed before the steam of blood had faded into the cold air. At night, the men built fires from scraps, broken muskets, wagon wheels, the last splinters of ruined villages. Around these flames they huddled, their shadows shivering against the snow. Yet many never woke when morning came. They lay stiff beside the embers, their faces glazed with frost, their limbs locked in the final gesture of reaching for warmth that never came. The frostbite claimed its share. Toes turned black, fingers shriveled, noses and ears fell away. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags, but the rags froze stiff, clinging to the skin. They walked on stumps of flesh, leaving bloody trails in the snow. Some begged comrades to cut away the blackened parts, others screamed as the knife bit into frozen flesh. Still, they staggered onward. Wolves followed them now, gaunt shadows slinking through the tree line. At first, the men ignored the howls, but soon the beasts grew bolder. They circled at night, darted in at dawn, and tore into the weakest who fell behind. The soldiers fought them with bayonets, drove them off with burning sticks. But the wolves always returned, patient and tireless, as though the wilderness itself had joined in the war against them. And then there were the Russians, not armies now, but small bands of Cossacks who struck like ghosts. They rode swift ponies across the snow, their sabers flashing in the pale light. They harried the stragglers, ambushed the weak, and vanished before the French could respond. To the starving men, they seemed not human at all, but demons conjured by the land itself, embodiments of the winter's cruelty. Through it all, the soldiers clung to fragments of hope. Some whispered of Vilnius, where supplies might be waiting. Others spoke of Smolensk, where food and shelter had once been promised. Each step carried the thought, just a little further. Just one more village. Just one more night alive. Yet the villages they reached were empty husks. Roofs collapsed, doors torn down for firewood, wells frozen solid. Sometimes they found a few kernels of grain, a few roots hidden beneath the floorboards. More often they found nothing but snow-covered ruins. The peasants who remained glared at them with hatred, offered no bread, only silence. To the French, these villagers seemed colder than the wind itself. As the weeks dragged on, discipline dissolved entirely. Muskets were cast aside because they weighed too much. Packs were abandoned in the snow. Men wore women's shawls stolen from cottages, cloaked themselves in rugs, wrapped their heads in strips of bedding. They no longer looked like soldiers. They looked like beggars wandering a white wasteland, their eyes hollow, their lips cracked and bleeding. Still, Napoleon pressed forward. His marshals tried to hold the ranks to summon order, but the men no longer listened. They moved by instinct, by desperation, by the single-minded will to put one frozen boot in front of the other. Some spoke to themselves, muttering prayers or curses. Some laughed madly, driven to delirium by hunger. Others simply stopped walking, sat down in the snow, and closed their eyes. Just a rest, they would whisper, just for a moment. And their comrades knew they would never rise again. The landscape itself seemed endless, cruelly repeating. White plains, dark forests, frozen rivers, and skies that shifted from gray to black. Never offering sunlight that could warm the skin, time lost its meaning. Days blurred into nights, nights into days. The soldiers could not tell how long they had been marching, only that each step carried them closer to death. By the time they reached Smolensk, thousands had already perished. Those who arrived expected salvation. Instead, they found only more ruin. The stores were depleted, the shelters overcrowded, the hopes of relief crushed. Smolensk was not a sanctuary. It was a graveyard where the half-dead staggered in, only to collapse in its streets. Napoleon looked upon the wreck of his army and still believed he could salvage it. He gave speeches, promised survival, insisted on pressing forward. But the men no longer heard him. They had become shadows of themselves, trudging forward not out of faith, but because motion was the only thing that kept the blood from freezing in their veins. And so the retreat dragged on, westward, through the ruins of villages, across frozen rivers, through forests where the trees groaned with frost. Behind them lay Moscow, a city of ashes. Ahead of them lay France, a dream slipping further away with each step. The Emperor's Grande Armée, the greatest host Europe had ever seen, was unraveling into dust, one frozen soul at a time. By the time the army stumbled past Smolensk, it was no longer an army at all. It was a tide of broken men, drained of color, their faces hollowed into masks of bone and frost. Once, these soldiers had been strong, young, full of the rhythm of marching songs and the thunder of drums. Now they were shadows, drifting westward, barely human, half alive. They had begun to lose the sense of who they were. Rank meant nothing. The gilded epaulets of officers, once polished bright, now hung in tatters. Generals who once commanded thousands trudged silently beside the lowest conscripts, indistinguishable in rags and furs stolen from peasants. Muskets, bayonets, cartridge boxes, the symbols of war, had been abandoned in the snow. What use was a musket when there was no strength to lift it, when no food could be won from the endless white? The men clung to one thing only, survival. And even that, for many, became a thought too heavy to carry. They slept standing, leaning against one another like trees in a storm. They chewed leather straps until their mouths bled. They clawed at the frozen ground in search of roots. When a horse collapsed, the starving descended in silence, knives flashing, teeth tearing at raw flesh. Some ate with trembling hands, others stared blankly, too weak to move, until comrades forced scraps between their lips. And there were whispers of men who had eaten not horse, not dog, not bark or leather, but human flesh. No one dared admit it, but the rumors moved like smoke through the ranks. On the endless road in the white silence, men disappeared. Sometimes their comrades explained it away. He fell behind, or he froze in the night. But sometimes there were no words. Only glances hollow, ashamed, afraid, and the knowledge that desperation had stripped them beyond recognition. Discipline vanished. There were no neat formations, no crisp salutes, no order. The army had dissolved into knots of wanderers. Small groups clung together for warmth, for comfort, for the faint illusion of brotherhood. But even brotherhood cracked beneath the weight of hunger. Men stole from one another, tore blankets from sleeping comrades, hoarded scraps of food, turned their backs on the dying. The road became a silent war of every man against the cold, against hunger, against time itself. The nights were the worst. Darkness fell early, swallowing the land in black silence. The stars glittered like ice chips, mocking in their brilliance. Men gathered in circles around small fires, their faces hollow, their eyes glowing with desperation. The fires burned low, for there was little left to feed them. Muskets, once the pride of soldiers, now lay in flames, sacrificed for a few more moments of heat. Wagon wheels, broken doors, splintered furniture dragged from ruined villages, all fed the flames, all vanished into sparks. And still, it was never enough. When dawn came, it revealed the dead. They lay stiff and silent, frozen into grotesque statues. Some had curled in their cloaks, faces hidden, as though seeking warmth in dreams. Others sat upright, eyes glazed, staring into eternity. Comrades shook them, whispered their names, then fell silent. There was no time to mourn. The road demanded movement, and so the living stepped past the dead, leaving them to sink into snow. It was during this retreat that the Berezina River appeared like a wall of ice and despair. Wide, frozen at its edges, but treacherously liquid at its heart, it barred the path to safety. On the far bank lay the road to Vilnius, to escape to the faint hope of survival. On their side lay the Russians, pressing closer, eager to trap them against the water. The crossing became chaos. Napoleon's engineers struggled to build bridges from splintered wood, their hands stiff with frost, their tools clumsy in the cold. Men surged toward the river, desperate, trampling one another in their frenzy. Cannon rolled into the ice, cracking it open, sending horses and wagons plunging into the freezing current. The screams of drowning men mingled with the thunder of muskets and the shouts of Cossacks sweeping down on the stragglers. Some tried to wade through the icy water. Their bodies seized, froze, stiffened, and disappeared beneath the dark. Others clung to makeshift rafts, which shattered, spilling them into the current. On the bridges, the press of bodies grew unbearable. Men were crushed, shoved into the water, trampled beneath boots. Thousands perished in those hours, drowned, frozen, cut down, and yet, across the bridges, some staggered through. Blackened feet, rags for coats, hollow eyes staring without expression, but alive. They crawled onto the western bank, collapsed in heaps, shivered, and rose again. The Berezina had claimed thousands, but it had not swallowed all. The remnants moved on, westward still. By then, Napoleon himself had abandoned them. He slipped away in a sleigh, racing for Paris, leaving behind the wreck of his Grand Army to save his empire with words and promises. For the men left in the snow, his absence meant little. He had already become a distant figure, almost a myth. The soldiers no longer thought of emperors or victories. They thought only of bread, of warmth, of survival through one more night. They were no longer soldiers. They were phantoms wandering a frozen wilderness, haunted by the memory of what they had been. Their boots were gone, replaced by rags tied around bleeding feet. Their coats were stolen from corpses, from villagers, from one another. They carried no banners, no drums, no music, only silence. A silence so deep, so heavy, that even their own footsteps seemed swallowed by it. And in that silence many wondered if they had already died. If the endless march westward was not a retreat at all, but a passage into some frozen afterlife, the Grand Army, 500,000 strong when it crossed the Niemen, was now a scattering of survivors. Each one carried not the pride of conquest, but the weight of a nightmare carved into bone. The retreat from Russia was not merely a military disaster. It was the unmaking of men, the stripping away of all that was human until only shadows remained. By the winter's deepest grip, the Grand Army was no longer a tide of men, but a scattering of survivors, drifting west like leaves blown by an unkind wind. The road that once bore 500,000 footsteps now carried only fragments, hollow-eyed soldiers wrapped in rags, limping on frostbitten stumps, too weak even to raise their heads. It was not a retreat in the proud sense of armies withdrawing in order. It was an unraveling, a slow dissolving into the snow. The Polish frontier lay ahead, but it might as well have been another world. Each village along the way was both a promise and a curse. A promise of shelter, perhaps bread, perhaps warmth, and a curse, for more often than not, the huts stood empty, their doors torn away for firewood, their wells frozen solid. The peasants who remained eyed the French with loathing. To the villagers, these men were not soldiers, not heroes, but invaders who had burned fields, stolen food, and left ruin in their path. Now, the land gave nothing in return. The soldiers begged, bartered, and sometimes fought one another for crumbs. A crust of bread became treasure, a handful of grain a feast. Men clawed snow into their mouths to quench thirst, though it chilled their bellies into agony. In their hunger, they dreamed of food constantly, roasted meats, steaming loaves, hot soups. Dreams so vivid they woke with tears freezing on their cheeks. Illness swept through the ranks like a shadow. Typhus, dysentery, fevers born from filth and exhaustion. Men coughed blood into the snow, their bodies too weak to resist. Once stricken, few recovered. Their comrades no longer had the strength to carry them, so the sick were left by the roadside, their moans swallowed by the endless white. Those who stumbled on did so with blank stares, numb to all but the next step. The road itself became a graveyard. Corpses lay half-buried in drifts, their limbs twisted, their faces locked in silent screams. Horses sprawled stiff-legged, frozen mid-stride. Wagons lay overturned, their wheels broken, their cargo scattered. The army left behind not just men, but the very bones of its existence, cannon abandoned, muskets discarded, flags lost beneath the snow. It was as though history itself wished to erase their passing. And yet, in this bleakness, there were moments, brief sparks of what it meant to be human. A soldier sharing the last scrap of bread with a comrade. A group huddling together, singing fragments of half-forgotten songs, voices cracked but still carrying warmth. A man lifting another to his feet, whispering, "Not here. Not yet, one more step." Such moments did not conquer the winter, but they defied it, if only for a breath of time. When the survivors finally reached the Berezina's far side, they believed the worst was behind them, but the march westward remained unrelenting. Snowstorms blinded them, winds howled without mercy. The ground itself seemed hostile, each step sinking into drifts that clutched at their legs. Wolves still stalked the columns, their howls echoing across the plains. And the Russians pursued, not always with battles, but with constant pressure, pushing, harrying, never letting the survivors rest. At last, in December, the Polish border came into view. The land of the Duchy of Warsaw, where allies might offer bread, fire, perhaps safety. But even here, death did not loosen its grip. Disease had thinned the ranks so severely that men collapsed within sight of shelter, unable to take another step. Villagers in Poland wept at the sight of them, not out of pity for Napoleon's grand cause, but out of sorrow for the wretches who staggered past, barely recognizable as human. Of the 500,000 who had crossed into Russia, perhaps 100,000 remained when they reached Poland. And of those, tens of thousands were too broken ever to march again. Their bodies bore frostbite, scars, and sickness. Their minds carried memories more painful than any wound. Those who lived would never forget. They would never forget the comrades frozen beside them, the nights spent gnawing bark, the long columns dissolving into silence. They would never forget the sight of the Berezina, the crush of bodies on the bridges, the screams as ice swallowed men whole. They would never forget the endless plain, white and merciless, where so many dreams of empire sank beneath the snow. Napoleon returned to Paris, speaking of victories, of strategy, of reasons for the campaign's collapse. He shaped words into shields, as emperors do. But the soldiers, those who had marched, starved, frozen, and survived, carried the truth in their bones. They knew that no map, no proclamation, no speech could capture the weight of that winter. For them, the campaign was not glory. It was not politics, nor power, nor destiny. It was hunger, frost, silence, and death. It was comrades falling one by one until only a handful remained. It was the knowledge that the land itself had turned against them, and that no emperor's dream could overcome it. In the villages of France, widows waited for husbands who would never return, mothers for sons whose names had been swallowed by the snow, children for fathers whose bones lay unmarked in the Russian earth. The empire had lost an army, but the families had lost their blood, their future, their hope. And yet, as history often does, the world remembered the emperor. The maps of Europe still bent and shifted at his will. The chronicles recorded his battles, his strategies, his speeches. But the soldiers, the forgotten soldiers, vanished from the story. Their names were never written, their suffering never honored. Only silence remembered them, the silence of the Russian winter that had claimed their breath. Even today, if one walks the fields and forests of Russia in the deep of winter, the air carries a weight as though it remembers. Beneath the snow lie bones that no one gathered, scattered across miles of frozen land. The Grand Army may have marched in glory, but it died in silence, its soldiers fading into the white, their voices lost forever. They had dreamed of returning home, of warmth, of familiar faces. Instead, they remain in the endless winter, eternal exiles in a land that swallowed them whole. The road out of Russia was a road out of life itself. Those who walked it left pieces of their soul behind, step by frozen step. And those who never walked it to the end remain there still, in the whiteness where the forgotten soldiers sleep. When the remnants of the Grand Army limped into Poland, the world did not at first understand the magnitude of what had happened. How could it? An army of nearly 500,000 had marched eastward. Surely, Europe thought, such power could not vanish. Surely Napoleon, the man who had bent kingdoms to his will, had triumphed as always. But in the streets of Warsaw, the truth staggered into view. Survivors arrived in heaps, dragged in carts, carried on the shoulders of comrades, or limping on feet wrapped in filthy rags. They were no longer soldiers. Their uniforms were shredded into ribbons, their weapons lost or abandoned. Some wore peasant shawls, others animal skins, others nothing but tatters clinging to skin burned black with frost. Their faces told the story more than words ever could. Hollow eyes stared at nothing. Lips cracked and bleeding whispered prayers, curses, fragments of songs. Skin stretched over bone. Fingers missing, ears gone, noses eaten away by frostbite. They smelled of smoke, rot, and sickness. They looked like men who had risen from the grave, staggering through life only because death had not yet closed its grip. The villagers wept at the sight of them. Women offered scraps of bread, cups of thin broth, a place near a fire, but many survivors were too far gone to eat or drink. Food made them sick, warmth too sudden for their bodies to bear. They had marched so long in the frozen void that life itself seemed alien. Some died within hours of being saved, their hearts unable to bear the return of comfort. News spread quickly. Europe whispered of disaster, of catastrophe, of the emperor's army swallowed by the Russian snows. But Napoleon moved swiftly, as he always did. He left his men behind and sped back to Paris in a sleigh, racing faster than the rumor of defeat. By the time the truth reached the French capital, he was already there, spinning words into armor. He told the people that the army had been preserved, that all was not lost, that new soldiers would rise and victory would return. His voice was steady, his presence unbroken. The legend of Napoleon endured, for the moment. But among those who had survived, there was no legend, only memory. Those memories were not of glory. They were of the long road, the endless snow, the hollow cries of men freezing in the night. They remembered comrades who had begged for bread, who had begged not to be left behind, who had begged for the mercy of a bullet when the cold became too much. They remembered the silence of villages where no one came to help, the howls of wolves circling the dying, the black water of the Berezina swallowing thousands. Some could never speak of it. They returned home, sat by the fire, and stared into the flames in silence. Families asked, but they gave no answer. The memories lay locked behind their eyes, too heavy for words. Others spoke too much, pouring out tales of horror that few wanted to hear. What use was it for the farmer, the merchant, the mother, the child, to know what the emperor's dream had cost? In towns across France, widows waited for letters that never came. Mothers waited for sons whose names were now buried in Russian snow. Some received word of death, but most received nothing, silence, absence, and emptiness that stretched on forever. The empire had no time to honor the dead. It needed new armies, new victories, new sacrifices. Yet among the survivors, a bitter truth lingered. They had not been defeated by soldiers, but by the land itself. The Russians had fought, yes, but it was the frost, the hunger, the endless distance that had done the killing. It was a war not against men, but against the earth and the sky. And in that war, no general could claim victory. The Russians, too, remembered. They remembered villages burned, fields stripped bare, homes turned to ash. To them, the retreat was justice, the land's revenge upon the invader. They told stories of French soldiers begging for food, of starving men stealing from barns, of corpses stiff in the snow. For Russia, the campaign became legend, proof that no conqueror could master its vastness, proof that the land itself was a weapon stronger than any cannon. For France, it became a wound. Not at once, but slowly, as the years passed, as the names of the lost could no longer be denied. Napoleon would raise new armies, would fight again, would march across Europe with banners flying. But the shadow of 1812 followed him. Every soldier who put on a uniform knew what had happened to those who had gone before, knew that glory might end not in victory, but in silence beneath the snow. And the forgotten soldiers, those whose bones still lay scattered across the Russian plain, became ghosts in history. Their families remembered them, their comrades mourned them, but the empire did not speak their names. History remembered the emperor, the marshals, the battles. It did not remember the man who froze while clutching a ragged blanket, the boy who died with leather in his mouth, the father who begged for bread and never rose again. Yet their presence lingers. Beneath the soil of Russia, beneath forests and fields, lie the bones of men who once dreamed of France, who once believed in the emperor, who once marched eastward in the summer sun. Their voices are gone, but the silence they left behind still speaks. It speaks in the empty spaces of history, in the pauses between Napoleon's words, in the sorrow of villages where widows waited in vain. It speaks in the cold wind across the steppe, in the long nights of winter, in the stillness of snow that covers everything. The Grand Army had marched in glory. It returned in fragments. The emperor spoke of strategy, of politics, of victory yet to come, but the soldiers knew the truth. They had not been conquered by men. They had been devoured by the winter, and in that devouring they became forgotten, but not gone. For every silence remembers. Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1812, not as a conqueror, but as a man running from the wreckage of a dream. Yet, when he stepped once more into the halls of power, he wore no shame, no defeat. His voice carried the same confidence, his eyes the same fire, as if the disaster in Russia were nothing more than a temporary setback. He knew the truth, but he also knew the power of illusion. To the French people he declared, "The army lives. The emperor still commands. France will rise again." The snow, the hunger, the shattered bodies, these were not spoken of. Instead, he spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of battles won along the way. He painted the retreat as a trial, not a catastrophe. And in a nation bound by his charisma, many believed him. But the survivors knew otherwise. Those who had crawled home on shattered feet, those who bore the scars of frost and starvation, carried a story Napoleon would never tell. They were the living evidence of the nightmare, men who had once marched in neat lines, their uniforms gleaming, now reduced to shadows with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes. In village taverns, whispers grew. "My brother went with the emperor, but he did not return. My son froze in Smolensk. They ate horses, they ate leather, they ate each other. These words spread quietly, for to speak too loudly was dangerous. The empire had little room for dissent, and Napoleon's grip on power was still strong. But truth does not vanish simply because it is unwelcome. It lingered, gnawing at the edges of the emperor's illusion. Meanwhile, Europe was not blind. The Russian disaster emboldened Napoleon's enemies. Austria, Prussia, and Britain saw weakness in the French giant. They saw that the man who had crushed armies and crowned kings was at last vulnerable. They began to whisper of new coalitions, of new wars, of striking while the empire bled. Napoleon, tireless, moved with astonishing speed. He called for fresh levies, demanding boys barely out of childhood to don the uniform. Across France, drums sounded once again. Families who had already given sons to the snows of Russia were forced to give more. Mothers wept at the sight of young boys in oversized boots, carrying muskets they could hardly lift. The soldiers of 1813 were not the veterans of Austerlitz, nor the hardened men who had crossed Europe under the imperial eagle. They were young, untested, and frightened. Some had grown up hearing of Napoleon's glory, but their first lessons in war were not victories. They were the stories of fathers and brothers lost in the winter beyond the Niemen. Still, the emperor drove them forward. In Germany, he raised new armies and hurled them into battle. For a time, he even found victories, as if fate had not yet abandoned him completely. At Lutzen and Bautzen, the French fought with desperate energy, pushing back their enemies. Napoleon himself rode among them, the old fire burning in his eyes, reminding Europe that the eagle still soared. But the truth could not be hidden. The Grand Army was gone, and no amount of recruits could replace it. The veterans of Russia, those few who survived, knew it in their bones. They marched again, some out of duty, some because they had no choice. Yet they marched without illusions. They had seen the limits of the emperor's power, seen him humbled not by generals, but by snowflakes and hunger. And behind them, France mourned in silence. The widows who waited for their dead would now wait for more. The fields that had lost men to Russia would lose them again to Germany. The weight of loss spread like a shadow, though Napoleon tried to mask it with triumphs. Among the survivors, memories of Russia became sharper with each new campaign. Men would whisper by campfires of the nights on the frozen steppe, of the comrades left behind. They carried Russia with them always, a ghost that marched at their side. Some said the Grand Army had never truly returned, that it still wandered in the snow, its bones rattling beneath the ice, its voices carried by the wind. Even in victory, the emperor could not escape this ghost. When he looked upon his new armies, he knew they were not the men who had once followed him without question. The loyalty was there, but not the same trust. For how could soldiers give their faith fully to a man who had led so many to die in the cold, unmarked, forgotten? Russia had cracked the myth. It had not destroyed Napoleon, not yet, but it had pierced the aura of invincibility that had shielded him. He was still emperor, still master of Europe's battlefields, but he was no longer untouchable. And as Europe gathered its strength, preparing to strike, the shadow of 1812 loomed over every step he took. For the forgotten soldiers, the men who lay in the snow, nameless and unburied, the war was already over. But for those who lived, the war stretched on. Each battle a reminder of what had been lost, each march a step further from home. They carried Russia in their scars, in their silence, in the haunted look of men who had walked with death and returned. And so the illusion endured. Napoleon spoke of strength, France cheered, new armies marched. But beneath it all, the truth waited. The snows of Russia had not simply ended a campaign. They had begun the slow unraveling of an empire. By the spring of 1813, Europe trembled on the edge of change. The once mighty Grand Army was gone, swallowed by the Russian snows. And though Napoleon had raised new legions, the cracks in his empire could not be hidden. His enemies saw the weakness. Prussia, emboldened by the emperor's retreat, declared war. Austria, waiting in silence, sharpened its sword. Britain, rich with gold, poured money into the coalition. And Russia, scarred yet unbroken, vowed to drive Napoleon back across Europe until he stood no more. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the world had yet seen. For the first time in years, the balance of power tilted against France. And yet, Napoleon remained defiant. He had been the master of Europe, the man who had crowned himself emperor and rewritten the rules of war. He would not bow now. In May, at Lutzen and Bautzen, Napoleon struck with the speed that had once defined him. His young soldiers fought bravely, though clumsily, their muskets shaking in inexperienced hands. Victory was claimed, but it was hollow. The enemy armies retreated, yet were not destroyed. Napoleon's genius still burned, but it burned against a wind that grew stronger each day. The survivors of Russia marched again, though they were but a fraction of their former numbers. Scarred, limping, hardened by frost and famine, they looked upon the new recruits with sorrow. "These boys," they whispered, "do not know what waits for them." They told stories by campfires of the road to Moscow, of nights when the snow buried the living, of comrades who begged for a bullet to end their suffering. The young soldiers listened in silence, fear flickering in their eyes. The ghosts of Russia marched beside them, unseen but felt. By October, the world closed in. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced the greatest force ever assembled against him. Over 500,000 men stood upon the fields of Saxony, Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes, and more, all united against the Eagle of France. For 3 days, cannon thundered, muskets roared, cavalry charged. Smoke choked the sky, and the ground turned to mud and blood. Napoleon fought with the brilliance of old, maneuvering his armies with precision, striking where the enemy faltered. But the weight was too great. For every regiment he crushed, another appeared. For every charge he ordered, the coalition answered with tenfold numbers. His new soldiers fought bravely, but bravery could not fill the void left by the Grand Army. Those who had died in Russia were not there to hold the lines, to rally the charge, to fight with the iron discipline of veterans. On the third day, disaster struck. A bridge over the Elster River was blown too soon, cutting off thousands of French troops from retreat. Men screamed as they plunged into the water, dragged down by the weight of their gear. The river filled with bodies, a vision all too familiar to those who had survived the Berezina the year before. For them, it was as if Russia had returned. The same chaos, the same screams, the same despair. By nightfall, the French army was broken. Napoleon, once the master of Europe, fled westward with the tattered remains of his forces. The coalition pursued, their confidence renewed. For the first time, it was clear the emperor could be beaten. Back in France, the illusion faltered. Families who had given sons to Russia, then to Germany, now wept for those lost at Leipzig. The countryside whispered of curses, of fate turning against the emperor. The widows multiplied, the orphans grew, and the once proud nation began to wonder if its glory had become its ruin. Yet still, Napoleon refused to yield. He retreated into France, raising new armies from exhausted villages, gathering boys and old men to fill the ranks. He told them of honor, of duty, of defending the homeland, and they believed him at least enough to march. But behind their eyes was fear, and behind their march was silence, the silence of the dead who had never returned from the snows of Russia. For those forgotten soldiers, their sacrifice echoed in every defeat. At Leipzig, men spoke of the missing veterans. If only the Grand Army were here. But the Grand Army was gone, its bones scattered across fields of frost. Russia had not only claimed them, it had claimed the future of the empire. For without them, Napoleon's wars could not endure. The coalition pressed onward. By 1814, they crossed into France itself. Battles raged across the countryside. Each one fought with desperate courage, each one a step closer to Paris. Napoleon's genius flashed still, but genius without strength is like fire without wood. It burns brightly, then dies. And so the shadow of Russia stretched long. It reached from the fields of snow to the streets of Paris, from the silence of frozen corpses to the thunder of cannons at Leipzig. It was not merely a disaster of one campaign. It was the unraveling of an empire, thread by thread, life by life. By the spring of 1814, the unthinkable became reality. Paris fell. Napoleon abdicated. The Emperor of Europe was sent into exile on the tiny island of Elba, but for the soldiers who had marched with him into Russia, there was no triumph in this fall. They had seen too much, lost too much to rejoice. Some limped home to empty villages where no one remained to greet them. Others carried wounds that never healed, both in flesh and in spirit. They had followed the eagle into the heart of winter, and though they survived, part of them had remained behind, frozen in the snows. And in Russia, the land kept its secret. The bones of the Grand Army lay scattered still, silent witnesses to the dream that had marched too far, too fast, and found only death waiting. The emperor was gone, but the forgotten soldiers remained, remembered not in glory, not in monuments, but in the whispers of history, in the empty places where their names should have been. By the winter of 1814, the storm Napoleon had unleashed upon Europe finally came home to France. For nearly 2 decades, the emperor had carried war into foreign lands, dictating peace in the palaces of kings. But now, the kings and emperors of Europe marched upon his own soil, their armies vast, determined, and vengeful. The campaign was desperate. Napoleon, with fewer than 100,000 men, faced armies 3 times his size. His genius still shone. In February and March, he struck with lightning speed, winning small victories at Campaubert, Montmirail, and Montereau. Once more, his soldiers marveled at his brilliance. The old magic seemed to live again. But the victories were fleeting. Every step forward cost lives he could not replace. Every town defended was followed by another abandoned. The soldiers who followed him now were boys barely grown, old men dragged from the villages, and the hollow-eyed veterans who had survived Russia. They fought bravely, but behind their courage was exhaustion. For them, this was not the glory of empire. This was survival. In the villages of France, despair grew. Families had buried sons from Spain, from Germany, from Russia. Now they watched foreign soldiers trample their fields, burn their barns, demand their food. The illusion of Napoleon's invincibility had shattered. Whispers spread that perhaps it was time for peace, even if it meant the emperor's fall. Paris itself trembled. As coalition armies drew near, the capital prepared for siege. But resistance was brief. In late March, the Allies entered the city. For the first time in centuries, a foreign army marched through the streets of Paris. The people stood in silence, watching as Russians, Austrians, and Prussians paraded past the Arc de Triomphe, the monument that was meant to celebrate Napoleon's eternal glory. The eagle had fallen. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. The man who had crowned himself Emperor of Europe, who had bent kingdoms to his will, who had once dreamed of a dynasty lasting 1,000 years, surrendered his throne. The coalition spared his life, but not his power. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba, a tiny rock in the Mediterranean, a cage for a man who had once commanded half a continent. To his soldiers it was unthinkable. Some wept openly when they heard the news. Others cursed, unable to imagine a France without their emperor. The veterans of Russia, those few who still lived, felt the weight of it most heavily. They had endured the snows, the hunger, the endless march, believing that their suffering had meaning, that the glory of France was eternal. Now they saw their emperor sent away in humiliation, their sacrifices reduced to ashes. Yet even in exile, Napoleon was restless. On Elba, he paced like a lion in a cage, watching ships sail past, listening for news from France. He knew his enemies thought him finished, but he also knew something they did not. The hearts of his soldiers still beat for him. The people might waver, kings might plot, but the men who had marched with him across Europe had not forgotten. And he was right. In 1815, less than a year after his exile began, Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to France. He landed with only a small force, but when he marched inland, soldiers sent to arrest him laid down their arms. They remembered his voice, his presence, his promise. They joined him instead. One by one, the regiments of France rallied to the eagle once more. In Paris, the people cheered his return. The 100 days had begun, Napoleon was emperor again, but behind the cheers, behind the renewed drums of war, the shadow of Russia lingered. The veterans who had survived 1812 were now older, weaker, fewer. The boys who now filled the ranks had grown up hearing whispers of the frozen march, of fathers and uncles who had never returned. They marched with pride, yes, but also with unease. For they knew what Europe had become since the snows, united, determined, relentless. At Waterloo, the end came. June 18th, 1815, a day of thunder and rain, of mud and cannon, of charges and countercharges. Napoleon fought with the brilliance of old, but the weight of the coalition bore down once more. When the Prussians arrived to join the British, the French lines broke. The eagle fell for the last time. After Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled again, but not to Elba, where escape was possible. This time he was sent to St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic, far from Europe, far from armies, far from the men who had once carried his banner across the world. And what of those men? The forgotten soldiers of Russia, those who had somehow endured the cold, now returned to silence. Some went back to their villages, tilling the same fields they had left years before. Others wandered the streets of Paris, broken beggars in tattered uniforms, their hands trembling with frostbite, their eyes clouded with memory. They received no monuments, no honors. France, eager to move on, buried their stories in silence. But they remembered. They remembered the long road to Moscow, the hunger, the snow, the endless retreat. They remembered comrades who had fallen and never risen, the bodies left unburied on the steppe. They remembered the emperor's voice urging them forward, and the terrible silence that followed when the cold devoured all sound. Napoleon was gone, exiled to die far from his homeland. His empire was gone, reduced to memory and myth. But the forgotten soldiers remained, not in glory, not in song, but in the quiet places of history, where suffering lingers long after the banners have fallen. The Russian winter had not only broken the Grand Army, it had broken the dream of empire. And in the silence of the snow, the truth endured. The war had ended, the emperor was gone, but the echoes of 1812 did not fade. In Russia, in France, across Europe, the memory of the Grand Army's destruction lingered like a shadow that could not be lifted. It haunted villages, it haunted battlefields, it haunted history itself. For Russia, the campaign became a story of triumph. The invasion had brought devastation. Yes, villages burned, crops stolen, families driven from their homes. Yet the land had endured, and the invader had been defeated not only by soldiers, but by winter, distance, and hunger. The Russians told stories of it for generations, of the peasants who burned their own fields so the French could not eat, of the Cossacks who harassed the retreat, of the endless snow that swallowed the enemy whole. To them, 1812 was proof that Russia could never be conquered. The land itself was their greatest ally. Monuments were raised in Moscow, churches rebuilt to commemorate victory. Families told tales around fires of the day the foreign emperor was driven out. Children grew up knowing that their ancestors had faced down the might of Europe and prevailed. The memory became legend, the legend became pride, and pride became identity. The scars remained, but so did the belief that Russia was invincible. In France, the story was different. Officially, the empire moved on. Napoleon was gone, the Bourbons returned, and politics consumed the nation. But in the homes of ordinary people, the silence spoke louder than any proclamation. Families who had lost fathers, sons, and brothers to the snows carried their grief quietly. There were no great monuments for the soldiers who had perished in Russia. Their names were not carved in stone. Their sacrifice was buried, like their bodies, beneath the snow and forgotten earth. Some veterans tried to tell their stories. Memoirs appeared, tales of the march, the hunger, the frost. But even these accounts often softened the horror, shaping it into something noble, something heroic. The raw truth was harder to bear. It was not glorious to die of frostbite, gnawing on scraps of leather. It was not noble to abandon a comrade too weak to walk. It was not majestic to sink beneath the ice of a frozen river. The real story was one of suffering, of despair, of ordinary men crushed between the ambitions of emperors and the cruelty of nature. The forgotten soldiers became exactly that, forgotten. Their families remembered them, yes, but France as a nation did not honor them as it honored victories at Austerlitz or Jena. The empire preferred triumph to tragedy, glory to grief, and so the silence deepened. Yet silence does not mean absence. In the countryside of Russia, farmers still plowed up bones in their fields decades after the retreat. Rusted muskets, broken buttons, fragments of uniforms appeared in the soil. grim reminders of the army that had once passed through. Children would find skulls in the woods, their mouths frozen in eternal cries. These remains spoke louder than any monument. They told the truth of what had happened when 500,000 men marched east and only tens of thousands returned. For the survivors, life was never the same. Some bore the scars of frostbite, missing fingers or toes. Others carried wounds that never healed properly. Many carried the weight of memory, the nightmares of freezing nights and endless march. They were not hailed as heroes. Often they were pitied, ignored, or left to beg in the streets. France wanted to remember victories, not defeats, and so the men who had endured one of history's greatest disasters were left in silence. But the story of 1812 could not be buried completely. Writers and poets began to take it up, transforming suffering into symbol. In Russia, it became the epic of endurance, the tale of a people who had outlasted the greatest conqueror in Europe. In France, it became a cautionary tale, proof that ambition without limit brings only ruin. Historians would argue over its meaning for centuries, but one truth remained constant. The soldiers themselves, the men who froze in the snow, were the ones who paid the price. Even today, the retreat from Moscow haunts the imagination. It is a story of hubris, of nature's wrath, of human suffering beyond measure. It is easy to speak of strategy, of battles, of politics. Harder, but truer, is to speak of the ordinary men who walked into a blizzard and never walked out. They were farmers, blacksmiths, clerks, fathers, sons. They had no choice in the matter, conscripted, pressed into service, swept up in the tide of empire. They marched because they were told to march. They died because one man dreamed of conquest. And in death, they were abandoned, left nameless on a foreign land. The ghosts of 1812 linger still. In the forests and fields of Russia, in the silence of French villages, in the unmarked graves scattered across thousands of miles. They do not cry out in anger, but in silence. A silence that reminds us that history's grandeur is often built upon the bones of the forgotten. Napoleon's star burned bright, then fell. But the men who carried his banners, who froze in his war, never had stars. Their lives were not written in marble or bronze. They were written in the snow, erased by the wind, remembered only by those who cared to listen. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. For when the cannons fall silent, when the emperors are gone, when the monuments crumble, it is the memory of ordinary men, their suffering, their endurance, their silence, that remains. The forgotten soldiers of 1812 did not ask for glory. They asked only for life, for warmth, for bread. Many did not receive even that, but their story endures, carried by the snow, whispered by the wind, haunting the pages of history forever. History remembers generals, emperors, and kings. It records the victories, the treaties, the coronations, the battles fought in bright sun. But history often forgets those who paid the price, those whose lives were reduced to statistics, those whose names vanish into the white expanse of snow and silence. The soldiers of Napoleon's Russian campaign are one such story. In 1812, nearly 500,000 men marched east, crossing rivers, forests, and endless plains. They carried muskets, banners, and hope. They carried dreams of glory, loyalty to their emperor, and trust in the promise of victory. Yet the winter was merciless. Snow fell endlessly. Temperatures plummeted, reaching 30 degrees below zero. Rivers froze, then cracked under the weight of thousands of soldiers. Food disappeared. Horses died. Men starved. Frostbite stole fingers, toes, ears, noses. The ordinary soldier, the peasant conscript, the clerk turned infantryman, the boy pulled from the fields, bore the brunt of this disaster. They were not strategists. They were human beings, fragile against the might of winter. Their endurance became legend not because of strength, but because they survived at all. For every one who limped home, hundreds perished, leaving no trace beyond frozen corpses on the steppe. The psychological toll was just as severe as the physical. Men witnessed comrades begging for food, freezing to death, or succumbing to madness. Some turned to cannibalism. Some deserted only to vanish into the forests or be captured by Russian forces. The silence of the dead was a constant companion. The survivors carried that silence with them. It clung to their souls like frostbite to bone, refusing to leave even when they returned to France. The consequences were not just personal, they were political. Napoleon's illusions of invincibility were shattered. Europe had seen the power of nature as a weapon, of human ambition undone by forces beyond control. The retreat from Moscow emboldened the coalition powers, hastening the end of Napoleon's empire. Every battle that followed, Leipzig, Paris, Waterloo, bore the imprint of Russia. The absence of those veterans, the physical and emotional scars they carried, altered the course of European history. Yet within this tragedy, there were lessons. One is humility. Empires are not invincible, no matter how brilliant their leaders. Nature does not bend to ambition. A frozen steppe in November does not negotiate, and hunger does not understand glory. Men may march, but their bodies are fragile instruments. Without preparation, without support, they succumb. Napoleon had underestimated winter as a weapon, and it cost him not just an army, but the momentum of an empire. Another lesson is the cost of ambition. Leaders often speak of conquest, strategy, and history, but the people who enact those plans endure the consequences. For the Grand Army, ambition was tangible, frozen hands, wasted flesh, endless march. For the world, it is easy to celebrate victories and write legends. For those who froze, ambition meant suffering beyond imagination. They were the invisible victims of history's grandeur. Memory, too, carries its own lesson. The forgotten soldiers demonstrate how history chooses its heroes. Napoleon is remembered in paintings, books, and monuments. The Russian generals, too, are immortalized. But those who suffered in the snow, those men who gave their bodies and souls to a dream, are absent from the grand narrative. Their names exist only in fragments and letters in the silent grave beneath the ice. And yet their story persists, waiting for recognition, teaching us that history is more than just triumphs. It is also loss. The silence of the snow itself becomes a teacher. The vast emptiness of the Russian plains, where soldiers vanished without trace, reminds us that not all consequences are visible. Some histories are buried beneath layers of earth, ice, and time. The human cost of ambition is often hidden, known only to those who survived or those who care to seek it. Even today, travelers who walk the roads from Smolensk to Moscow can feel traces of this history. Fields that once swallowed thousands now bloom in silence. Forests rustle over unmarked graves. Rivers, calm in summer, once swept away men and horses alike. The landscape remembers, and through it the lessons echo: preparation, humility, caution, and remembrance. Finally, there is endurance. Despite the horror, the survivors returned. Despite frostbite, hunger, and grief, they rebuilt their lives. They walked home to empty villages or waiting families, often unrecognized. Some shared their stories, others held them in silence. They endured, and through endurance they left a mark. History may have forgotten their names, but the resilience of the human spirit persists through their example. The forgotten soldiers of 1812 remind us that the cost of history is paid not only in strategy and politics, but in flesh and blood. They teach us empathy for those caught in the machinery of ambition, and they challenge us to remember those whose suffering does not make it into textbooks. Their sacrifice, silent yet immense, continues to resonate, not in glory, but in the quiet spaces between monuments, the gaps in history and the stories that remain untold. And so the snow of 1812 speaks across centuries. It whispers of men who followed, who suffered, who froze, who endured. It reminds us that history is never complete without acknowledging the human cost. The lessons are harsh, but they endure. Respect for nature, humility before ambition, and remembrance for those whom the world forgot. The Grand Army was lost, the Emperor defeated, and Europe forever changed. Yet the story of the soldiers who marched into the frozen East, and those who survived, remains a testament to human endurance, to suffering, and to the quiet courage that never makes the headlines. Even in silence, the snow remembers. The story of Napoleon's Russian disaster often feels like a vast painting, endless lines of men stretching across snowy plains, a faceless mass swallowed by the blizzard. Yet within that mass were individuals, each with a name, a voice, and a story. Their lives remind us that history is not only made of emperors and generals, but of countless men whose footsteps left no trace except in memory. Consider Jean-Pierre, a young farmer from Burgundy. He had never left his village before being conscripted into the Grand Army. He marched east with pride, carrying the musket placed in his hands, his head filled with stories of Napoleon's victories. For Jean-Pierre, the campaign began with hope, the chance to see the world, to return home a hero. But by the time winter set in, his hopes had turned to ash. He remembered the taste of fresh bread from his mother's oven, the warmth of his father's fields in spring. As he staggered through the snow outside Smolensk, frost clinging to his face, he whispered those memories like prayers. When he finally collapsed, unable to rise, the snow became his last cradle. His name would never be recorded in a grand history, but his story echoes in the silence. Then there was Heinrich, a Bavarian drummer boy, no older than 16. He had marched with the rhythm of the drums, keeping the pace of his regiment. His small hands, once steady on the drumsticks, froze and cracked in the cold. When his drum was lost in the chaos of retreat, Heinrich wept, not for himself, but because he had lost the heartbeat of his comrades. They had relied on his rhythm in battle, and now only silence remained. His officers tried to console him, but he felt he had failed. Heinrich's youth, stolen by war, became one of countless tragedies hidden within the march. Among the cavalry was Etienne, a veteran of earlier campaigns in Italy and Austria. He had known victory and defeat, but never such relentless suffering. He had once prided himself on his horse, a proud stallion named Noir, but food grew scarce, and Etienne faced a terrible choice. When the horse could no longer continue, Etienne wept as comrades slaughtered it for meat. He could not bring himself to eat the flesh, yet hunger eventually broke his resolve. Every bite felt like betrayal. When he returned to France, Etienne never spoke of that night, but his silence told the story more clearly than words ever could. There were also women camp followers, laundresses, and wives who had marched alongside the army. Marie Claire was one such woman, a washerwoman from Paris who had followed her husband into Russia. When he was killed in the advance on Moscow, she found herself alone, clinging to survival among the soldiers. She carried water, mended clothes, and shared her scraps of food with the wounded. As the retreat grew desperate, Marie Claire became a ghostly figure, moving through the ranks like a shadow of endurance. She survived, though scarred by memories of frozen rivers and endless hunger. In her resilience, she embodied the quiet courage of countless women erased from official records. And then there were the nameless, the men who fell in forests, buried under drifts of snow, never seen again. Their voices are imagined, their stories pieced together through fragments of diaries and letters. One French officer wrote of a soldier who sang softly to himself as frostbite claimed his limbs, his song fading into silence with the dawn. Another recalled a Polish grenadier who carried his wounded comrade for miles before collapsing beside him, both swallowed by the storm. These fragments are all that remain of lives once vibrant, now frozen in history's margins. The retreat was not only a march of suffering, but a march of memories. Each soldier carried with him the image of home, villages, families, lovers, children. In the endless white, these memories became both comfort and torment. For some, they offered strength, the thought of returning to warm hearths and familiar faces. For others, they became unbearable reminders of what would never be regained. Hope was fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind. Diaries from the time tell us much. Officers described columns of men reduced to skeletons, wrapped in rags, staggering forward without words. They noted how discipline dissolved. Soldiers no longer marched in formation but in scattered groups, each man clinging to survival. They wrote of eyes hollowed by hunger, of men who stared ahead as if already dead. Some burned their muskets for warmth, others traded boots for a crust of bread. The dignity of soldiers was stripped away, leaving only the raw struggle to live. Yet even amid despair, humanity surfaced. Men shared the last of their rations, carried the wounded until their strength gave out, and offered prayers over fallen comrades before moving on. In the vast cruelty of winter, small acts of kindness shone brightly, even if briefly. These acts remind us that even in catastrophe, people cling to compassion. When survivors returned to France, they bore scars deeper than wounds. Some had lost fingers, toes, or entire limbs to frostbite. Others carried memories too heavy to speak aloud. They were haunted by the faces of comrades left behind, by the cries that had faded into the night. Some found solace in silence, never speaking of Russia again. Others shared their stories, ensuring that fragments of truth survived. But for many, life never returned to normal. Their souls had frozen alongside their bodies in that terrible winter. The forgotten soldiers of Napoleon's retreat are not merely statistics. They were men and women with dreams, with laughter, with sorrow. Their stories, Jean, Pierre, Heinrich, Etienne, Marie-Claire, and the countless nameless, weave together into a tapestry of endurance and loss. Each thread is fragile, but together they remind us that history's grandeur is built upon the sacrifices of ordinary lives. As the snow covered their bodies, it also covered their stories. Yet the silence of the Russian plains still whispers. If we listen closely, we hear their voices, faint but insistent, reminding us that they once lived, once marched, once hoped, once froze. The French remembered Russia as endless whiteness, a place where the cold itself became a weapon. Yet for the Russians, the land was not simply an obstacle, it was home. The very fields and forests that sheltered peasants became a hostile labyrinth for the invaders. To the French, Russia was alien and unyielding. To the Russians, it was familiar, an ally in their struggle against the Grand Army. As the French marched east in the summer of 1812, villages emptied. Peasants abandoned their homes, taking livestock, food, and tools deep into the forests. Those who remained often set fire to what they could not carry. The Russian strategy was not only military but elemental: deny the enemy shelter, deny them food, force them to starve and freeze beneath the endless sky. For Napoleon's soldiers, accustomed to campaigns that lived off the land, this was a nightmare. Empty villages stared back at them with hollow eyes, charred roofs collapsing inward, wells poisoned, barns empty. Every step eastward deepened their hunger. The Russian peasants knew the land intimately. They dug into forests, hid stores of grain, and guided their own families away from the path of the invaders. For them, survival meant resilience. For the French, it meant ruin. The land itself seemed complicit in the defense. Wide rivers delayed crossings, marshes swallowed wagons, forests concealed partisans who struck without warning. Partisan warfare became a constant terror. Bands of peasants armed with axes, pitchforks, and old muskets descended upon stragglers. Cossacks on swift horses haunted the flanks of the French columns, swooping in with sudden violence before vanishing into the steppe. Soldiers who lagged behind, sick, wounded, or starving, often fell into their hands. Few returned. Stories spread among the French of peasants who showed no mercy, of villages where survivors were tortured or executed. Whether all these stories were true did not matter. Fear itself became another weapon. For Russian soldiers, the winter was also harsh, but it was their winter. They wore heavier furs, knew how to find shelter, and had supply lines that reached them more effectively than the French. Even so, they too suffered. The Russian army endured hunger and frostbite, but unlike the French, they were defending their own soil and morale remained stronger. Every frozen French soldier on the road was proof of their victory. The land mirrored the will of its people. In September, Moscow itself was burned. Flames consumed the city, denying Napoleon the prize he sought. The French, entering the empty capital, found not triumph, but silence, not supplies, but ashes. Napoleon waited, hoping for peace, but Russia offered only fire and snow. Moscow's destruction was more than strategy. It was a declaration. Russia would sacrifice even its heart to resist. As the retreat began, the land closed in like a fist. Snowstorms erased roads, turned rivers into death traps, and suffocated the wounded. Wolves, hungry in the harsh winter, followed the army, preying on the dead and sometimes even the living. The silence of the plains was broken only by wind, by the creak of frozen leather, by the groans of men collapsing into snowdrifts. The land was pitiless, yet it was not mindless. It had been turned into a weapon by those who knew it best. The peasants, watching from their hidden shelters, saw the mighty French army unravel before their eyes. They had once feared these men, with their glittering uniforms and foreign tongues. Now they saw them as broken figures, staggering, desperate, more shadow than soldier. Some peasants offered no help, fearing reprisals or simply wishing for vengeance. Others, in rare moments of compassion, gave scraps of bread or a corner of shelter. But for the most part, the French were left to the mercy of the snow. The Russian soldiers marching behind the retreat saw the road littered with corpses. They did not pity their enemy, for this was war, and the memory of villages burned by the invaders was fresh in their minds. They pressed forward, relentless, harrying the stragglers, ensuring that the retreat was not merely a withdrawal but a rout. For them, every frozen Frenchman was justice for Moscow, for Smolensk, for the countless peasants driven from their homes. Yet even the Russians were not untouched by horror. They too witnessed starvation, frostbite, and the brutal indifference of nature. They too buried comrades in the frozen earth. But unlike the French, they fought in familiar territory, defended by distance, climate, and a people unwilling to surrender. For them, the land was not an enemy, but an ally that demanded sacrifice. The French soldiers, stumbling westward, began to understand this cruel truth. They had marched not only against Russia's army, but against Russia itself. The villages, the fields, the rivers, the forests, the very sky, all had risen against them. Every snowflake was a weapon, every gust of wind an enemy. In their suffering, they saw the land not as neutral ground, but as a living force, bent on their destruction. When at last the remnants of the Grand Army crossed back into friendly territory, they left behind tens of thousands of corpses scattered across the Russian landscape. For years, peasants would uncover bones in their fields, reminders of that terrible winter. Travelers spoke of roads lined with skeletons, of abandoned wagons frozen into the earth, of buttons and musket parts rusting in the soil. The land had swallowed an army and kept its memory beneath the snow. For Russia, the campaign became a legend of resilience. It was not only the generals who won, nor even the soldiers, but the land itself. The vastness, the cold, the emptiness, these had been the true defenders of the Russian heart. Napoleon had underestimated not just winter, but the will of a people who saw their homeland as inseparable from their survival. And so the story of the land remained central to the disaster. The plains, the forests, the frozen rivers, the silent villages, they were more than a backdrop. They were active participants, shaping the fate of empires. For the French, they became a nightmare. For the Russians, they became salvation. For history, they became the silent witness to one of the greatest tragedies of war. The land fought back, and in its whiteness, an empire was undone. Amid the chaos of the retreat, one figure stood at the center of it all, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had risen from obscurity to dominate Europe, the general whose name once meant certainty of victory. But in Russia, the emperor was no longer a god of war. He was a man surrounded by ruin, haunted by the silence of an army that no longer obeyed his dreams. Napoleon had entered Russia with grand ambition. He believed that one decisive battle would bring Tsar Alexander to his knees, that Moscow would be the prize that forced Russia into peace. For weeks he had pursued that vision, pushing his men deeper into the Russian expanse, always waiting for the moment when the enemy would finally break. And when Moscow burned, Napoleon did not see it as defeat at first. He saw it as a challenge. He waited for peace. He expected the Tsar to send envoys. None came. Instead, winter descended, and with it the collapse of everything he had built. Accounts of Napoleon during the retreat reveal a man torn between pride and despair. He tried to maintain the image of command, issuing orders, directing movements, speaking of regrouping. Yet even he could not ignore the reality. His soldiers were dying by the thousands each day. Reports from generals grew increasingly grim. Supplies had vanished. Horses collapsed on the roads. Entire regiments dissolved into wandering stragglers. Even the Imperial Guard, his proud elite, were reduced to rags and hollow faces. To the soldiers, Napoleon remained a distant figure, sometimes glimpsed on horseback, wrapped in a great cloak, silent as he surveyed the ruin around him. They still saluted, still looked to him with remnants of faith. But the myth of invincibility had cracked. They had followed him across Europe, through Italy, Egypt, Austria, Prussia, Spain. They had seen him turn defeats into victories, disasters into triumphs. Yet in Russia, no brilliance could fight the cold. No strategy could outmaneuver hunger. The emperor who had outwitted so many armies now stood powerless before the snow. Napoleon himself suffered the cold, though not as his men did. He had furs, a carriage, warmth that the common soldier lacked. Still, he felt the bite of winter, the creeping despair of watching his grand design unravel. Witnesses describe him lost in thought, riding silently at the head of columns that had once marched proudly and now stumbled in misery. His face, once animated by energy and calculation, grew pale, marked by exhaustion. The man who had bent kings to his will now seemed at the mercy of forces beyond control. Yet even in the depths of disaster, Napoleon clung to calculation. He knew that his empire depended on survival. If he perished in Russia, or if his entire army was annihilated, the balance of Europe would collapse against France. His mind turned constantly to strategy, not of winning Russia, but of saving what remained, of retreating with enough strength to fight another day. It was not glory he sought in those weeks, but survival. He gave orders to burn wagons that could not move, to abandon cannons frozen in the mud, to keep the columns moving no matter the cost. He urged his men forward, speaking of France, of families waiting, of victories yet to come. He tried to kindle hope, but his words fell against the weight of hunger and frost. To starving soldiers, even the voice of their emperor was only another sound carried away by the wind. Inside, Napoleon wrestled with pride. He was a man who had never admitted defeat, who believed destiny had chosen him. Yet each day of retreat was a reminder that destiny could be cruel. He had thought himself master of Europe, and now he was reduced to calculating how many men might cross the next river alive. Pride urged him to hold on, to imagine recovery, to believe that even in disaster he could emerge stronger. Reality told him otherwise. The retreat gnawed at his spirit. He was haunted by the silence of Moscow, by the fire that consumed it, by the Tsar's refusal to bend. He replayed his decisions. Should he have turned back sooner? Should he have stopped at Smolensk? Should he have avoided Russia altogether? These questions lingered in his thoughts, though outwardly he never confessed doubt. To his officers he projected certainty. To himself he felt the weight of choices that could not be undone. Napoleon's relationship with his men shifted during the retreat. Once they had adored him, seeing in him a leader who shared their hardships, who marched beside them. Now, though many still respected him, they also muttered about the madness that had led them into the frozen abyss. Some cursed his name, even as others still whispered prayers for his success. The bond between emperor and soldier was strained, but not broken. Even in ruin, some clung to him as the symbol of France. When Napoleon finally left the army to return to Paris, slipping away in December to preserve his empire politically, it was an act of necessity but also a wound to his image. The man who had always marched at the head of his troops now abandoned them to generals. He traveled swiftly, wrapped in secrecy, while his soldiers continued to die in the snow. To some, this was betrayal. To others, it was simple survival. Without Napoleon in Paris, France itself might crumble. In the years that followed, Napoleon would reflect on Russia with bitterness. He blamed the cold, the Russians, the betrayal of allies. Rarely did he admit his own miscalculations. Yet deep down, he knew that Russia had broken him in a way no battlefield ever had. It had stripped him of invincibility. It had shown him that even an emperor could not command the seasons, that even genius bowed before nature. Napoleon in the snow was not the conqueror of Europe, not the strategist of Austerlitz or the visionary of empire. He was a man facing the limits of ambition, a figure swallowed by silence. The image of him riding through the frozen columns, wrapped in his cloak, has endured because it captures the essence of tragedy, greatness undone, dreams collapsing, destiny defied by the simplest of forces, hunger, cold, and time. The emperor survived. His empire limped on. But the man who left Russia was no longer the same. He carried with him the ghost of an army, the memory of white fields littered with the fallen, and the knowledge that his star had begun to dim. The snow had not killed him, but it had marked him forever. The further Napoleon's army marched into the Russian expanse, the more the land seemed to blur into a single, unbroken whiteness. Snow fell endlessly, not in gentle flakes, but in thick, suffocating curtains that swallowed the horizon. Soldiers trudged forward with their heads bowed, their bodies bent against the storm. unable to distinguish where the earth ended and the sky began. The endless snowfields became both their prison and their executioner. Boots, already worn thin from months of marching, offered little protection. Leather cracked, sawdust split, and many had no choice but to wrap rags around their feet, only to find the cloth froze stiff within minutes. Frostbite turned toes black, swelling grotesquely before they fell off entirely. The endless sound of crunching snow was punctuated by groans of agony, men stumbling as their feet failed them, collapsing into the drifts they could no longer conquer. The snow erased all landmarks, leaving the soldiers disoriented. What should have been a road was buried deep, invisible under layers of white. Men wandered off the path without realizing it, vanishing into the wilderness where no one followed. Their cries for help were muffled by the wind, swallowed before they could reach another's ears. The endless fields seemed to conspire with the elements, luring men away from the dwindling column, one by one. Worse still, the snow destroyed their supplies. Food wagons overturned, their wheels stuck in drifts. Horses, starved and skeletal, collapsed beneath the weight, their bodies left half buried as the army marched past. Even when supplies were found, sacks of flour or salted meat, they froze solid, impossible to prepare without fire. And fire itself became a treasure wood, was scarce, damp, and often too frozen to burn. Men huddled together for warmth, their breaths forming icy plumes that crystallized in their beards and hair. The soldiers began to suffer not just from the cold, but from a strange emptiness that seeped into their spirits. The white void stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no promise of shelter, no sign of life, not even a distant tree. Some said the snow had a voice of its own, a whispering, hollow sound that filled their heads when they tried to sleep. It was as though the land itself wanted them to surrender, to lie down and let the cold claim them. At night, the sky mirrored the land below, vast, blank, and merciless. Stars flickered faintly, offering no warmth, only a reminder of how small and insignificant the soldiers had become in this frozen universe. Their bodies curled into shapes that resembled the dead, and in the morning, many did not rise. The survivors moved on, stepping around their fallen comrades without the strength to bury them. Soon, the snow itself covered the corpses, erasing them from sight. And yet, even in this desolation, the soldiers clung to a faint thread of hope. They told themselves that beyond the horizon, beyond these endless snowfields, lay villages with food, warmth, and safety. But the horizon never changed. It stretched onward like a cruel illusion, a mirage painted in white. The further they marched, the more they realized that the snow was infinite, a world without end. Still, they moved forward, because standing still meant death. Their frozen lips whispered prayers, curses, or names of loved ones as they trudged on, their footprints the only scars upon the pristine white. Behind them, the wind swept even those away, leaving no trace that they had ever been there at all. The snow was not just a landscape, it was an enemy. Silent, merciless, eternal. And it was winning. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once bent the crowns of Europe to his will, now rode through the blizzard like any other soldier swallowed by the storm. The man who had commanded kings and emperors, who had walked through the gates of conquered capitals as if they were his own, found himself surrounded by ruin, by men reduced to shadows, by the silence of an empire dying in the snow. He still carried himself like an emperor. His uniform was immaculate compared to the rags of his soldiers. His cloak heavy and lined with fur, his hat still the symbol of command. But even this image was fraying. The cold spared no one. His cheeks were raw with frost, his lips cracked, his hands trembling even through his gloves. The weight of the storm pressed down on him, just as it did on his men. And though they still looked to him with hollow eyes, searching for hope, even he had nothing left to give. Napoleon had always believed in his destiny, in the star that had guided him from Corsican obscurity to the throne of France. He believed that his will alone could bend the world to his vision. But here, in the white deserts of Russia, that belief began to falter. He saw his men stumbling, not in neat formations, but as scattered clusters of half-dead wretches. He heard their groans, their muttered curses, their whispered prayers. He smelled the rot of frostbitten flesh, the stench of horses dying in the snow. This was not the Grande Armée he had led into Russia. This was a procession of ghosts, and he their unwilling shepherd. Each night, reports came to him, numbers of the dead, lists of officers lost, units that had simply ceased to exist. He read them in silence, his face an unbroken mask, but inside he felt the ground shifting beneath him. For the first time in his life, he faced not an enemy that could be outmaneuvered, not a foe that could be defeated by clever strategy, but an adversary that was untouchable. The Russian winter could not be bribed, flanked, or deceived. It could only be endured, and endurance was failing. Rumors reached him of madness in the ranks. Men claiming to see visions in the snow, whole groups wandering off toward phantom fires or cities that did not exist. He dismissed the stories outwardly, but in his private moments he wondered if even he might succumb. For when he stared too long into the storm, he too thought he saw shapes moving, shadows flickering just beyond the veil of snow. Sometimes he thought he saw the enemy, waiting, silent and patient. Other times he thought he saw his own past armies in their glory, banners flying, the cheers of victory. But when he blinked, all was gone, only the storm remained. The officers who still surrounded him spoke little. Once, they had filled his headquarters with conversation, with plans and maps and the energy of conquest. Now they sat in silence, wrapped in blankets, their eyes hollow. They still addressed him as sire, still waited for his decisions, but the awe was gone. They were men clinging to ritual because it was all that remained. Napoleon himself tried to maintain routine. He gave orders. He marked routes. He spoke of regrouping, of survival, of reorganizing once they reached safety, but his words carried no fire. His voice, once sharp and commanding, now sounded distant, muffled by the endless wind. He knew his soldiers no longer heard the man who had led them across Europe in triumph. They heard only another tired voice among the many, and yet he forced himself to continue. Each morning he rose, mounted his horse, and placed himself in the column, visible to his men. He knew what they saw, their emperor still standing, still unbroken, still marching with them. It was not hope, not truly, but it was a thread. And in those moments, when the soldiers glanced at him with hollow eyes, some found the strength to take one more step, and then another. But Napoleon was no fool. He saw the truth clearly. His dream of Russia was shattered. Moscow, once the symbol of his triumph, had been nothing but ash. Now the road back was a graveyard, stretching endlessly behind and before him. He had led 500,000 men into this land. Soon only a fraction would remain. The Grande Armée, once invincible, was dying not in battle, but in silence, swallowed by snow. He had conquered nations, but he could not conquer the cold. He had broken armies, but he could not break the hunger. He had bent kings to his will, but he could not bend the storm. For the first time, Napoleon Bonaparte felt not like a master of fate, but like any other man, small, fragile, and terribly, terribly mortal. Still he rode on, wrapped in his cloak, his eyes fixed on the endless white. He knew that history would remember him. But would it remember these men? The nameless soldiers who froze, who starved, who vanished into the drifts, leaving no trace but whispers in the snow? Perhaps not. And that was the weight he carried heavier than the cold, that the empire he had built on glory might end here, not with a clash of arms, but with silence. The retreat was no longer a march, it was a scattering. What had once been the proud Grande Armée had dissolved into fragments clumps of men staggering forward, separated by stretches of empty snow, their lines broken beyond repair. There was no order, no rhythm, no certainty. The road westward, which had promised salvation, revealed itself as a trail of death. Every mile was marked by corpses. Some were buried in shallow drifts, only an arm or a boot jutting from the snow. Others lay sprawled openly, frozen in the positions in which they had fallen, one with his arms outstretched, another curled like a child, another sitting upright as though still resting for a moment. Horses littered the path, their ribs showing through their skins, their stiff bodies scavenged by starving men who hacked at the frozen flesh with bayonets. But the snow was not their only enemy. The Russians had begun to close in. Cossacks on swift horses appeared at the edges of the columns, striking like wolves at the weak and stragglers. They came out of the storm without warning, their cries sharp, their lances glinting. A few men tried to resist, but muskets, frozen and clogged with ice, misfired or would not load. Powder refused to spark. The soldiers of Napoleon, who had once shattered Europe with their firepower, found themselves defenseless against a handful of raiders. The Cossacks killed those who resisted, captured a few for sport, and left the rest to panic. Then they vanished into the snow, leaving behind only fear. The soldiers cursed them as cowards, but deep down they envied the Cossacks. The Russians seemed to belong to this land, moving through the snow with ease, their horses finding paths where Frenchmen sank waist deep. The invaders, by contrast, were like intruders in a hostile world, rejected at every step. Ambushs grew more frequent. Entire groups of stragglers vanished, swallowed not by the snow this time, but by Russian steel. Supply wagons, when they appeared, became magnets for attacks, and soon there were none left at all. The men were left with nothing but what they carried, and most carried nothing but despair. Hunger grew unbearable. Men gnawed at pine bark. They boiled grass roots dug from under the snow. They chewed buttons and leather until their jaws ached. Some grew delirious, believing they could feel food on their tongues, only to realize they were biting into their own flesh. And always there were whispers of darker meals rumors too dreadful to voice aloud, yet too believable to deny. The retreat turned brother against brother. A man who collapsed was stripped within moments, his coat, boots, and rags stolen by the living before his body grew cold. Friends looked at one another not as comrades, but as potential sources of warmth, of sustenance, of survival. The bonds of loyalty, forged in years of war, were unraveling under the weight of snow and starvation. The officers tried to enforce order, but their commands carried little weight. Few men listened. Discipline was meaningless when death walked beside them at every step. Yet even in chaos, some fragments of loyalty clung on. A handful of men still rallied when a drumbeat echoed faintly in the storm. Some still carried standards, though no army remained to follow them. Others refused to abandon their wounded officers, dragging them along until they collapsed themselves. Small acts of honor flickered in the darkness, brief lights in a sea of despair. Napoleon himself rode among them, but even he seemed diminished, a distant figure swallowed by the storm. His presence was not enough to restore hope. The soldiers muttered under their breaths, some cursing him outright, others pleading silently for him to save them. But he could not. The emperor who had once commanded the destiny of nations now had no power against the storm, no command over the snow. The retreat had become not a journey but a nightmare. Each day was the same, endless marching, endless falling, endless dying. The men no longer counted time in days or hours, but in steps. One more step, then another and another, each one a small victory against a fate that loomed ever nearer. They had come seeking glory. They had marched into Russia with drums beating, banners flying, songs on their lips. Now they shuffled silently, their faces hollow, their voices gone, their boots leaving faint impressions in the snow that the wind erased within minutes. The road westward stretched endlessly. Behind them lay Moscow, a city of ashes. Ahead of them lay only uncertainty. And around them, closing in like a noose, lay the Russians, the snow, and death. The retreat had begun. But for most of the Grande Armée, it would not end. By now, the Grande Armée no longer resembled an army. It was a procession of shadows, a broken column stumbling across a land that rejected them with every step. Those who looked upon the retreat later would say the soldiers did not march but drifted, as though they were already spirits wandering some purgatory. They no longer spoke of victory or even of survival. They spoke only of enduring the next step, the next breath, the next hour. The frostbite was merciless. Fingers blackened and split, falling away from hands that could no longer grasp weapons. Noses, ears, and cheeks turned to crusted wounds, leaving faces unrecognizable. Feet swelled and burst inside boots that offered no warmth until men left bloody tracks in the snow. Some cut their boots away, only to watch their feet crumble to useless lumps of flesh. Others limped until they fell, their comrades passing without pause, too weak to stop, too numb to mourn. Every sound on the road was a dirge. The crack of ice beneath boots, the rattle of a half-frozen cart. The low groans of the dying, answered only by the ceaseless howl of the wind. At times, a musket shot rang out not in battle, but in despair. Men, unwilling to continue, turned their weapons upon themselves. But even death was denied to many, as frozen gunpowder misfired or muskets cracked in the cold, leaving the soldier writhing, broken but not released. The Russians stalked them, not with the fury of pitched battle, but with patience. Skirmishes flared on the edges of the retreat, sudden bursts of violence when Cossacks swept in like predators. They did not need to fight the whole army. They took the stragglers, the weakest, the slowest. Sometimes they struck at night, galloping into camps, scattering the starving men, then vanishing before any defense could be mounted. The survivors whispered that the Russians were not men but phantoms, guardians of the snow who could never be caught, never be killed. Supplies had long ceased to exist. Men rummaged through corpses, stripping away frozen breadcrumbs, gnawing at scraps of horsehide clutched in dead hands. The horses that remained were skeletal, their bones sharp beneath sagging skin. When one collapsed, the soldiers fell upon it like wolves, hacking apart the carcass before the breath had left its body. They ate raw flesh, frozen organs, anything that could fill the void in their bellies. And when even the horses were gone, they turned inward, whispering of darker meals in the dark hours, though no one dared speak it openly. The road west was not a path but a graveyard. Wagons, abandoned and broken, stood half-buried in the snow, their wheels splintered, their cargo scattered and useless. Muskets lay rusted and bent. Cannons, too heavy to haul, were left behind like monuments to futility. The soldiers trudged past them without a glance, each relic a reminder of an army that no longer existed. The men themselves looked less like soldiers than walking corpses. Their uniforms hung in tatters, their colors lost beneath layers of filth and frost. Their eyes were hollow, sunken deep into skulls that no longer seemed to belong to the living. They moved without expression, without voice, their mouths too dry and frozen to form words. When they did speak, it was in hoarse whispers, the sound of wind through broken reeds. And yet still they marched. Not for glory, not for their emperor, not even for France, but because movement was the only thing that kept death at bay. To stop was to freeze, and to freeze was to vanish. The snow claimed men silently, laying its soft blanket over their bodies, erasing them from sight as though they had never been. By dawn, the footprints of the living passed over the hidden graves of the dead, and the march continued. Napoleon rode among them, but he too seemed like a phantom, distant, unreachable, a figure cloaked in silence. Some men cursed him, blaming him for the endless road of suffering. Others still clung to him as a symbol, the last ember of hope in a sea of despair. But even the emperor, wrapped in his heavy cloak, could not fight the snow. He could not change the faces of the men who trudged past him, their eyes glazed, their steps uneven, their souls already halfway gone. The retreat had become something more than war. It was a pilgrimage into death, a slow procession through a land determined to erase them. The soldiers no longer belonged to France, nor to their regiments, nor to their emperor. They belonged to the snow, to the cold, to the silence. They were no longer men of flesh and blood, but figures of frost and shadow, fading with each step. It was said that on that road one could hear not the roar of an army, but the sigh of ghosts. If the retreat had been a nightmare, then the crossing of the Berezino was its climax and ordeal so savage that survivors would remember it not as a battle, but as a vision of hell itself. By late November, the Grande Armée, what little remained of it, reached the banks of the Berezino River. The water was half frozen, a black serpent winding through fields of snow. It should have been their salvation, the gateway to the west, to escape, to survival. But the Russians were waiting. On the far bank, their forces blocked the crossing. Behind the French, more Russian armies closed in. Napoleon's remnants were trapped in a tightening noose. For days, panic churned among the starving ranks. Some men stared at the water and thought of plunging in, hoping the current might carry them to freedom. But the ice was treacherous, too thin to hold, too thick to swim through. The current dragged whole trees downstream like twigs. To enter the river was to die. And yet, to remain on the bank was also to die, either from hunger, the cold, or the Russian guns. Napoleon gave the order. Bridges must be built. But what wood was there to use? The forests had long since been stripped bare for firewood. And so, soldiers tore apart wagons, hacked down the last skeletal trees, even ripped beams from abandoned houses to build makeshift pontoons. Dutch engineers, heroes of this nightmare, waded waist-deep into the freezing torrent to anchor the foundations. Men watched their skin turn blue, watched their limbs stiffen like wood, until some collapsed into the water and were swept away. Still, others stepped forward to take their place, hammering timbers with half-frozen hands, driven by desperation more than discipline. When the bridges finally stood, the exodus began. What followed was not order, not an army's crossing, but chaos incarnate. Thousands surged toward the narrow planks, each man consumed with one thought: escape. Officers screamed themselves hoarse, but command had long since dissolved. Civilians, camp followers, wives, children pushed forward alongside soldiers. Horses reared and stumbled, wagons toppled, and muskets clattered to the ground as men clawed their way across. The bridges groaned under the weight. Planks cracked, ropes strained. At one point, one of the structures gave way, plunging hundreds into the river below. They flailed for moments before the current swallowed them, their cries cut short beneath the ice. The living watched, horror frozen on their faces, but none stepped back. There was no choice but forward. The Russians opened fire. Cannon thundered from the banks, shells bursting among the crowd. Whole sections of the column vanished in a spray of snow, blood, and splinters. Men screamed as grapeshot tore through their ranks, yet still they surged onto the bridge. Those who fell were trampled underfoot, their bodies crushed flat as the tide of survivors swept over them. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. And yet, in the midst of it, there were moments of defiance. French rearguards hurled themselves against Russian attacks, fighting with the desperation of men who knew they were already dead. They held the enemy back for hours, buying time for others to cross. Their sacrifice was absolute. Few of them lived to see the western bank. By nightfall, the river was clogged with the dead. Corpses bobbed in the current, their frozen faces staring blankly skyward, their limbs stiff as driftwood. Horses and wagons lay half-submerged, creating grisly islands in the stream. The air reeked of smoke, powder, and blood, a stench that carried for miles. When dawn came, the bridges were set aflame. Napoleon gave the order himself, for to leave them standing would invite the Russians across. Though still trapped on the eastern bank, thousands of stragglers, wounded, and camp followers were abandoned. Their screams rose as the flames consumed their only hope, but the army could not wait. Survival demanded sacrifice, and so the remnants turned their backs and marched on. The Berezina had taken its toll. Of the hundreds of thousands who had once followed Napoleon into Russia, fewer than half staggered across that river. And of those who did, many were too broken to march much farther. The army was no longer an army. It was fragments, survivors, ashes of a dream that had burned too brightly. Yet still, Napoleon pressed westward. For him, every step beyond the Berezina was another toward survival, another toward France. For his men, however, each step was simply another act of endurance, a refusal to collapse, a defiance against a world that seemed determined to erase them. The Berezina was no crossing, it was a baptism of fire and ice. Those who lived through it would never forget. And those who died became part of the river itself, frozen into the eternal flow, carried ever onward into silence. The survivors of the Berezina crossing stumbled onward, their bodies battered, their spirits frayed, their minds haunted by the ghosts of the fallen. Poland lay ahead, but it was no refuge. The snow continued to bite, the winds continued to howl, and the roads were clogged with the dead and dying. Those who had once marched as a vast, disciplined army now shuffled in ragged lines, unrecognizable to anyone who had known them before the Russian campaign. Men moved like automatons. Frostbite had stolen the ability to grasp, to hold, to fire muskets, or even to button their coats. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, twisting their stomachs into knots that no amount of ice-cold water or meager rations could ease. Their faces were gaunt, eyes sunken, lips cracked and tinged blue. Some had lost entire fingers or toes, their skin peeling like paper, their limbs useless. Every step was agony, every breath a battle. The death toll did not cease. Some fell to exhaustion, collapsing into the snow and never rising again. Others wandered off the road, drawn by mirages of villages, fires, or warmth, only to be swallowed by drifts, leaving no trace. Disease began to spread: typhus, dysentery, and fever, claiming men too weak to resist. Even those who survived the snow and hunger were vulnerable to the invisible killers now stalking the columns. Napoleon, still mounted, still an emblem of authority, rode among the remnants, but his power was more symbolic than practical. Orders were shouted, but few could be obeyed. Units had disintegrated, officers were dead or missing, and men now answered to their own desperation rather than command. He could not force bodies to move, nor could he feed mouths that would not be fed. The Grande Armée existed only in name, yet still some semblance of structure remained. Groups of officers tried to rally their men, forming small battalions for safety, sharing whatever supplies they had. They attempted to tend the wounded, to mend the frozen, to carry those who could not walk. But their efforts were overwhelmed by sheer numbers of the sick and the dying. Each act of compassion was a battle against despair itself. The landscape offered no mercy. Forests had been stripped bare months before, rivers were icy and treacherous. Villages were abandoned, their homes stripped for firewood by the retreating army itself. The snow-covered fields stretched endlessly, white and unbroken, leaving men to march for days without seeing a single living creature besides themselves and the corpses of their comrades. Morale was at its nadir. Soldiers no longer spoke of glory, of France, or of Napoleon's campaigns. Conversations, when they occurred, centered on immediate survival: where to find wood, how to thaw frozen feet, whether a snowbank could hide the body of a fallen comrade until it could be buried, or if burying was even possible. Many had ceased to hope entirely, moving forward only because stopping meant certain death. And yet, within this hollow victory, the mere act of survival, there was a strange resilience. The human instinct to endure burned faintly in each man. They took turns breaking ice to drink water, huddled together for warmth, shared whatever scraps they could find. In their silence, there was an unspoken pact to continue, to keep moving, even if the world had turned against them completely. Napoleon pressed westward toward Vilnius, toward Kaunas, toward Lithuania, and the borderlands of Prussia. Each step brought them closer to home, but each step was paid for in agony and blood. The soldiers who survived would not return as heroes in triumph. They would return as hollowed-out remnants of the glory that had once marched across Europe. They were witnesses to disaster, living monuments to the cost of ambition, pride, and war. By the time they reached the safer lands, only fragments of the Grande Armée remained. Families who had followed, camp followers, and the once proud battalions were gone. Villages that welcomed them offered little comfort, for most of the survivors were beyond nourishment or care. Their bodies ached, their minds trembled, their spirits were scarred. The snow had not merely frozen them. It had changed them, stripped them of innocence, youth, and memory of the life they had left behind. Napoleon's retreat through Russia was over, but the nightmare lingered. Moscow had been lost, hundreds of thousands of men gone, and the army that had once been the terror of Europe had been reduced to a handful of survivors. The land of ice and snow had exacted its price with cruel impartiality. History would record the campaign, but it could not fully capture the suffering, the despair, or the silence of the snow which had swallowed an empire one frozen step at a time. The survivors pressed on westward, hollow-eyed, broken, and forever changed. Their bodies were alive, but their souls bore the weight of the forgotten men who had frozen, starved or vanished, whose names would never be remembered. And in the endless winter, their footsteps were the only proof that they had endured at all. When the snow finally eased and the winds softened, the remnants of Napoleon's army trudged into territories that were no longer foreign but strangely familiar: Poland, Prussia, and the edges of Germany. Yet the land, though populated, offered little comfort. Villages stared silently at the ragged columns, unable to comprehend the scope of what had passed. The survivors were not soldiers in any recognizable sense. They were shadows of men, bodies still moving but hollowed, minds weighed down by loss, their eyes haunted by the countless faces swallowed by the Russian winter. The true scale of the disaster became clear as they counted themselves, or tried to. Of the 500,000 men who had entered Russia, only tens of thousands remained. Officers had perished alongside their men, regiments had ceased to exist, flags had been abandoned or burned. Entire corpses of the Grande Army had disappeared into forests, swamps, and rivers, leaving only footprints that the wind would erase. Families who had followed their loved ones as camp followers were gone, swallowed in the march. Horses, wagons, cannons, all the instruments of war had vanished or been destroyed. The army that had once commanded Europe was now little more than a procession of survivors staggering toward home. Napoleon himself survived, but he had learned the bitter truth of human fragility. The emperor, who had conquered kingdoms, who had commanded continents, could not command the cold. He could not shield his men from hunger or madness. He could not bend the winter to his will. And though history would remember him as a master strategist, the truth was that this campaign had humbled even him. His authority remained only as a symbol. His power, once absolute, had been eroded by forces beyond any human control. The men who survived returned changed. Many would never speak of the campaign. Those who did would whisper of snow that seemed alive, of hunger that turned men against one another, of whispers that haunted them in dreams and waking hours alike. They spoke of the Berezina River, where thousands had died in a single night, swallowed by water, ice, and Russian cannon fire. They spoke of frostbite, of fingers lost to the cold, of comrades who vanished without a trace. They spoke of the silence, the endless white, and the realization that the Grande Armée, once a symbol of invincibility, had been broken not by an enemy, but by the land itself. And yet in their survival, there was a bitter resilience. They carried stories of heroism, of men who had shielded others from the cold, of officers who had forced themselves to march despite injuries, of small acts of solidarity that flickered like candlelight in the endless storm. These fragments of humanity were what remained of the army, the proof that even in the harshest winter, even amid unimaginable suffering, the human spirit could endure. History remembers battles, strategies, victories, and defeats, but the soldiers who froze, starved, and vanished in Napoleon's Russian disaster are remembered only in fragments, their names lost, their deeds unrecorded. They were the faceless, the nameless, the forgotten. Yet their march left a mark not on maps or monuments, but on memory itself, the memory of what it means to endure, to survive, and to witness history in its most brutal form. The snow that claimed them has melted, the rivers have flowed, and the forests have regrown. But in the minds of those who survived, and in the whispers of historians who have pieced together the remnants, the winter of 1812 remains eternal. It is a testament to the unimaginable cost of ambition, the fragility of man in the face of nature, and the resilience required to continue when all hope seems lost. Napoleon returned to France, a ruler still respected, still feared, still powerful, but he carried with him the knowledge of loss on an incomprehensible scale. And for the men who followed him, who had marched, stumbled, and survived against all odds, life would never be the same. They had witnessed the abyss, walked with death, and endured the unforgiving Russian winter. They were the forgotten soldiers, the ghosts of the Grande Armée, whose courage and suffering would echo silently through history if only one knew where to listen. In the end, the story of Napoleon's Russian campaign is not one of conquest, but of survival. Not one of glory, but of the unbearable cost of ambition. And in the quietest moments, when the wind whispers over snowy plains, it is possible to hear, faintly, the footsteps of those who marched, the groans of those who fell, and the silence of those who were never found, the eternal presence of the forgotten soldiers who froze in the Russian disaster.